Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're diving headfirst into a concept presented in the source material that frankly sounds like, well, like an impossibility, right?
Definitely. An oxymoronic joke, almost.
We're talking about anarcho-monarchism.
It definitely grabs your attention,
Yeah.
especially how the source we're focused on, this essay titled AnmonEssay.pdf, it sort of kicks off by acknowledging that exact reaction.
Exactly. The essay doesn't shy away from calling it a seeming contradiction, but then, immediately pivots.
Right. Claims it's not contradictory at all, but it's synergy.
A synergy,
Yeah.
okay. It positions it as this deliberate blend trying to take the centralization and focused leadership you get with monarchism
Mhm.
and combine it with the chaos and freedom of anarchy.
Which sounds like mixing oil and water, doesn't it?
It really does. So our mission for this deep dive is to take this specific source material, which argues this can work, and presents it as a potential future model,
Mm.
and really dig into how. How does this essay claim to pull off that seemingly impossible synergy?
Well, what's fascinating is how the essay approaches leadership right from the start. It completely discards the traditional stuff,
Yeah.
inherited power, divine right, all that.
Okay, so tell us more about that claimed synergy. What's the core mechanism the source says allows, well, anyone to become a leader here?
The essay proposes a very specific, non-traditional path to leadership within this Anmon framework. It says anyone can become a king or queen.
Anyone.
Yeah, not by birthright, but simply by sitting on a throne,
Mm-hmm.
which seems more symbolic, really, and leading based on their ability to attract followers.
Attract followers how?
It emphasizes legitimacy comes from your law and the quality and benefits of joining your kingdom. That's the quote.
So it's purely based on merit and appeal then? No, like, magical bloodline or just brute force needed?
Precisely. The source is quite explicit on this. It states, no magical bloodline necessary or overpowering level of influence necessary.
Mm.
It frames it as being about attracting people through the value you offer. And the essay talks about strength in numbers being key, with the magic of the monarch being the ability to, like, clarify and spread that strength through their laws and their vision.
Okay, so the underlying idea is leadership by voluntary association, based on what the leader actually brings to the table. But how does the essay describe this actually functioning, like on a practical level? What are the mechanics, the structure?
That's a critical layer, definitely. Because in any system described as anarchist, the question of structure and legitimacy is, well, it's paramount. The essay outlines several foundational elements for how this anarcho-monarchism would operate.
Walk us through those elements. What does the source lay out?
Okay, first, and the essay calls this the cornerstone of legitimacy for any anarchist state within this model, is consent of the governed.
Right, consent.
But here, it's not just a philosophical ideal. It's presented as the active basis for a monarch's authority.
Okay, consent is familiar, but how does the source say it's actually implemented here? How does it work day to day?
It's deeply tied to contract law. The system, as described, is highly dependent on explicit contracts
Contracts between who?
between the monarch and the citizenry. Now, the monarch or their staff might draft these contracts,
Uh-huh.
but the essay makes it clear they require the approval of the citizens through their consent. So you're actively agreeing to specific terms by joining a particular kingdom.
That makes sense. So consent is formalized through a contract you agree to, and this operates within what the source calls polycentric governance. What's that?
Yes, that's another key structural element. The essay defines polycentric governance here as meaning, and I quote, no one government maintains a 100% market share monopoly through violence.
Okay, so no single overarching state forcing everyone under its rule.
Exactly. Instead, you'd have multiple kingdoms or governing bodies coexisting, competing in a sense.
Which sounds very much like the anarchist side providing the framework, allowing for competing authorities.
Precisely. And tied directly to that is freedom of movement. The source really stresses this. Citizens are free to leave your kingdom whenever you choose and join any other whenever you'd like.
So you can just pack up and go.
Yep. And the essay positions this free movement not just as a right, but as the replacement for our current system. It calls the current system a monopoly governmental system with its lengthy and flawed election process that it claims never results in real change and only creates further conflict. Strong words.
Very strong. So that freedom to leave is presented as a core check and balance in this model. Now, the essay, it makes some pretty bold claims about the advantages of anarcho-monarchism over existing systems, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It presents several arguments for why this structure, as it describes it, could be significantly more effective. especially when you contrast it with modern democracies.
Okay, let's dig into those claimed benefits. What does the source highlight?
Well, one of the essay's most striking claims, and maybe a key insight from its perspective, is the argument for unprecedented speed and efficiency.
Speed. How so?
The source claims a focused monarch can, quote, dream up and manifest clear law in a matter of hours and spread that message throughout their kingdom later that day.
Hours.
Yeah. And it draws a very sharp contrast here with democracies, which it says can take decades to implement meaningful change, often with depressing compromises and strings attached.
And it blames that on politicians.
It largely blames privileged politicians
Yeah.
beholden to the rich donor class. Yeah, then
Hmm.
that's the source's take.
Hours versus decades. That's quite the differential the author is proposing. Wow.
It certainly is. And building on that speed, the source highlights responsiveness to citizens.
Okay.
It argues that a good monarch, unburdened by huge bureaucratic processes, can quickly listen to and judge petitions from the citizenry and implement positive change rapidly.
So more direct access.
Yeah, leveraging the creativity and insight of every single individual. That's the idea. Again, it contrasts this directly with the democratic process, where a citizen's petition would need to somehow win over hundreds of politicians.
So a more direct, streamlined path from citizen concern to policy action, according to the source.
That's the core argument it's making.
Yeah.
The essay also claims scalability as a benefit. It says Anmon thrives at any size, whether you have a small kingdom of, say, 100 people or one with 100 million.
Interesting. And does the essay explain how that scalability interacts with, keeping things in check, preventing abuse of power, or
Yeah.
accountability?
Yes, that leads straight into the final advantage listed.
Hmm.
Accountability. The source argues that the mere existence of multiple smaller kingdoms operating under that polycentric governance idea,
Uh-huh.
that alone keeps the larger kingdoms honest and responsive.
How? Just by providing an alternative.
Pretty much. And it even includes a specific rule, a tenet. War or oppression of smaller kingdoms by larger ones violates the core principles of anarcho-monarchism and must result in legal consequences for the offending leadership.
Legal consequences enforced by whom in an anarchist setup, does it say?
It doesn't detail the enforcement mechanism specifically, but the implication seems to be collective action or loss of legitimacy among other kingdoms. But the key checks remain the freedom of movement and the existence of alternatives.
Right. That's crucial, a rule against expansion through force. Now, the source also talks about flexibility in the actual content of the laws or policies within these kingdoms. What kind of ideological range does the essay suggest is possible?
Yeah, this is where that contract-based nature becomes really flexible.
Yeah.
The essay states the contracts basically, the laws of a kingdom can include anything.
Anything. Like, truly anything.
According to the source, yes, within reason, presumably. It gives examples like citizens' arrest, a universal basic income, direct democracy, and other seemingly left-wing policies.
Wow, UBI and direct democracy under a monarch.
Asserting a monarch could include these if they believe they add harmony to their kingdom. That's the key word it uses, harmony.
So a monarch could essentially create a socialist-leaning kingdom if that's what they proposed and people consented to join.
That seems to be well within the realm of possibility the essay describes, yeah. It also notes that citizens can influence policy, too.
How so?
Yeah.
Beyond just leaving.
Well, it suggests they can also demand more left-wing policies if the surrounding Anmon kingdoms are also left-wing and doing well with that paradigm. So there's a kind of competitive pressure between kingdoms that could drive policy innovation or adoption. Market forces, almost.
Interesting. And how does the source position this whole concept on the broader political spectrum? Where does it sit?
The essay states Anmon is commonly referred to as Libertarian Center on the famous political compass.
Libertarian Center. Why center?
The rationale given is that the monarch's primary job is to synthesize policies and law, maybe some left, some right, whatever works, to create the most harmony and prosperity.
So pragmatic rather than rigidly ideological.
Exactly. This role of being a pragmatic curator focused on results and citizen consent is what the source claims separates Anmon from anarcho-capitalism or anarcho-communism, which it implies might be less adaptable or less focused on that synthesis.
It sounds like the essay presents the monarch's role less as a traditional ruler and more as a lead architect and manager, constantly needing to justify their model through results and continued consent.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
So how does the source position Anmon relative to current systems or even other maybe related ideologies like libertarianism?
It draws a direct comparison to libertarian capitalism, which it calls the preferred ideology of the day. Now, while acknowledging Anmon shares some goals with it,
Mm-hmm.
the source argues anarcho-monarchism provides much-needed clarity, focus, and compromise where libertarianism is lacking.
Clarity and focus presumably coming from that monarchical element, that single leader.
Yes, that seems to be the implication.
Hmm.
But it stresses a fundamental difference, something it says Anmon offers, and according to the source, libertarianism doesn't,
Which is?
breaking the existing government monopoly. The essay argues libertarianism alone does not do this, and that anarcho-monarchism requires anarchy to break down the existing legal paradigm first.
Wait, so the anarchy isn't just the ongoing state of multiple kingdoms, but a necessary first step. Like, you need chaos
Well,
first.
that's how the essay seems to frame the transition process, yeah. It describes needing anarchy initially to dismantle the current structure,
Okay.
and then requiring a wise and thoughtful monarch to build the law back up again in a new form that brings the most harmony and prosperity to this new Anmon kingdom.
So it's presented as a two-phase approach. Dismantle through anarchy, then rebuild under this focused, consent-driven monarchical leadership.
That's the picture the FA paints.
Okay, so we've taken a deep dive into this specific, intriguing, and maybe counterintuitive concept of anarcho-monarchism, based purely on the perspective laid out in this AnmonEssay.pdf source.
We've really tried to unpack how this source attempts to synthesize these seemingly opposite ideas, framing it as a synergy built on consent, contract law, and that polycentric governance idea.
And we looked at how the essay highlights those claimed benefits: speed, responsiveness, scalability.
And accountability, primarily through that freedom of movement and the competition between different kingdoms.
Right. It positions the concept as a libertarian center alternative and describes this process that involves first breaking down the existing monopoly before rebuilding under a consent-based monarch.
So this deep dive has given you, the listener, a pretty detailed look at this particular proposal from the source material, presenting anarcho-monarchism not as just a contradiction to be dismissed,
Yeah.
but as a concept the author argues is quite serious, and its methods hold much promise for the future of human civilization in the 21st century. Pretty bold stuff.
It is, and the essay leaves the reader with some direct questions, doesn't it? It invites you to consider this model on a really personal level.
Yeah, things like, will you join one? How large do you want the kingdom to be? What laws will govern it? And who will be your monarch?
It makes you think. And considering the source's final, very intriguing suggestion that you only need a pen and paper to begin. What does that imply? What does this radical idea of consent-based self-created governance suggest about, well, about your own relationship with the laws and societies you navigate today?
Something definitely to ponder.